The Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, ruling the landmark health law invalid. You know, millions of Americans rely on the health coverage under Obamacare, and the next legal battle over it is likely headed to the Supreme Court yet again. Hello and welcome to a brand new hour of America's News Headquarters. I'm Eric Shawn.
And I'm Arthel Neville. The decision coming on the eve of the sign-up deadline for coverage for next year. The federal judge siding with 20 Republican-led states that filed a lawsuit, arguing the individual mandate was unconstitutional and Obamacare could not be separated from it. California leading a group of states that plan to challenge the ruling, and Democrats say they will join the fight.
I have every confidence that we're going to join the lawsuit when Democrats take back the House. The Trump administration didn't defend the ACA, and that's not to say it's worked perfectly. We have lots of ideas on how to make it work better and build upon its success, but taking it away completely is a big mistake.
And we have Team Fox News coverage for you. Ellison Barber standing by in the North Lawn of the White House. She'll have more reaction from the Trump administration on this. But let's begin with Lauren Blanchard, who's live in Washington with more on the decision in Texas. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Eric. Well, a judge may have ruled the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional, but Obamacare will remain in place for now because even the White House has said they know appeals are coming. Let's break down the decision. A conservative federal judge in Texas, Reed O'Connor, ruled the Affordable Care Act invalid because he says when last year's tax bill eliminated the penalty for not having coverage, it knocked out the constitutional foundation. And the judge says Obamacare cannot be separated from that provision. Now, less than a week from a possible government shutdown, this is likely to become yet another divisive issue for Congress.
Congress failed to repeal and replace it, as many of us had promised. That's on us. That was a terrible failure of the Congress, but maybe this will now cause the issue to be revisited.
If this ruling were permitted to stand, 17 million Americans would lose their health insurance. So it would be devastating for the American people.
If the lawsuit makes it to the Supreme Court, as many think it will, it would be the third time the justices consider fundamental provisions of Obamacare, and twice it's been upheld. The ruling, not only the bad news for Obamacare, according to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, this year, 4.1 million Americans have selected a plan through healthcare.gov. Last year, this same time, 4.6 million. We also see a lag when it comes to new customers and those renewing their plans. Now, overall, analysts seem to think the biggest reason enrollment numbers are down this year, lack of awareness. Today is the deadline for 2019, and despite the ruling on the bill, people can continue to sign up. Eric?
All right, thanks so much. Arthel?
Well, Eric, the White House hailing that federal court ruling as a victory. This as President Trump calls on Congress to find a replacement for the Affordable Care Act. Earlier, he tweeted, quote, "As I predicted all along, Obamacare has been struck down as an unconstitutional disaster. Now Congress must pass a strong law that provides great health care and protects pre-existing conditions. Mitch and Nancy, get it done." Ellison Barber joins us now live from the White House with more. Hi, Ellison.
Hi, Arthel. Yeah, President Trump says this is good news for the country, for Americans. Democrats, of course, disagree. Soon to be Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, called it an absurd ruling that will be immediately appealed. She says this is not what the American people want, writing in a statement, quote, "In the midterm election, the American people delivered a record-breaking margin of almost 10 million votes against House Republicans' vile assault on health care." President Trump said this just a little earlier today.
We'll sit down with the Democrats if the Supreme Court upholds. We'll be sitting down with the Democrats, and we will get great health care for our people. That's a repeal and replace, handled a little bit differently, but it was a big, big victory by a highly respected judge, highly, highly respected in Texas. And on the assumption that the Supreme Court upholds, we will get great, great health care for our people. We'll have to sit down with the Democrats to do it, but I'm sure they want to do it also.
The president made those remarks during an unannounced visit to Arlington National Cemetery. He went there to see the wreaths that thousands of volunteers have spent the day laying in the rain in Arlington to honor fallen service members buried there. Arthel?
Definitely a very special presentation. Hey, Ellison, so the president, meanwhile, he announced staff changes last weekend. He announced more today. More changes. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, quite a few of late. President Trump announced this morning that Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke will leave his post at the end of the year. Zinke has faced a lot of ethical questions and more than a dozen federal investigations related to his travel habits and potential conflicts of interest. Over the summer, the Interior Department's Inspector General launched an investigation into a real estate deal that involved a foundation set up by Mr. Zinke and a development group backed by the chairman of Halliburton. They're one of the largest oil service companies in the world and a company that does a whole lot of business with the U.S. government. This is the second high-profile departure in about as many weeks. Last week, the president announced that his chief of staff would leave at the end of the year. The president's top pick to replace General John Kelly did not pan out. Some of the reported top contenders pulled themselves out of the running. Yesterday, the president announced a replacement. He said Budget Director Mick Mulvaney will take over as acting chief of staff. He made that announcement on Twitter, where he also pushed back on some of the rumors, some suggestions that people did not want the chief of staff job, and that's why it took him a little longer than we initially expected to announce the replacement. He said, in his words, Arthel, he said many people wanted the job. Arthel?
All right, we'll leave it there. Ellison Barber, thank you.
You bet.
Well, the Office of Robert Mueller, the special counsel, pushing back now against General Michael Flynn's claims of improper actions, saying Flynn should have known it was a lie or that you should not lie to federal investigators. You know, the rebuke comes after the former national security advisor suggested the FBI did not tell him about the penalties he could have faced ahead of time when he sat down for an interview at the White House. Garrett Tenney has more on all this from Washington.
Michael Flynn's attorneys argue he was coerced into lying when he spoke to the FBI in January of 2017. Newly released court documents show that then Deputy Director of the FBI Andrew McCabe urged Flynn not to bring an attorney to an interview with agents. In a note, McCabe wrote that he told Flynn he wanted to have two of my agents interview him as quickly, quietly, and discreetly as possible, adding, I further stated that if Lieutenant General Flynn wished to include anyone else in the meeting, like the White House counsel, for instance, that I would need to involve the Department of Justice. Flynn then agreed to meet with the agents alone. The documents also show the FBI intentionally chose not to tell Flynn that it's a crime to lie to the FBI. But Mueller's team argues the Bureau did nothing wrong and that nobody forced Flynn to lie on multiple occasions to agents as well as members of the administration about his contacts with Russia's ambassador, writing, quote, a sitting national security advisor, former head of an intelligence agency, retired lieutenant general, and 33-year veteran of the armed forces, knows he should not lie to federal agents. But critics, including Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz, say Flynn's case highlights some of the unsavory tactics the special counsel is using in its investigation.
What Judge Ellis was saying is what Mueller is doing is trying to find low-hanging fruit, figure out every way to get them to commit a crime. It's their fault if they commit the crime, and then squeeze them so that they'll sing or compose. Welcome to how special counsel operate.
The special counsel's office has recommended Flynn serve no jail time due to his cooperation. He is scheduled to be sentenced on Tuesday, but it's possible with these new filings, the judge could delay that hearing. Back to you guys in New York.
All right, Garrett, thanks so much. Arthel?
Well, Eric, there are new questions about the Border Patrol's treatment of migrant children after a 7-year-old Guatemalan girl died while she was in immigration custody. Jackie Heinrich joins us now with more. Jackie?
Arthel, there are questions over whether Border Patrol gave that little girl any food or water during the 8.5 hours she was held in Antelope Wells, New Mexico, all before a bus brought her to a processing center an hour and a half away. By the time she arrived there, she was not breathing. The little girl's been identified as 7-year-old Jacqueline Calmaquin from Guatemala. She and her father were detained with more than 160 others in a remote stretch of desert before being bused in groups to Lordsburg. When she was first detained at Antelope Wells, Border Patrol didn't note any illness, and her father signed a waiver saying she was in good health. Less than 48 hours after, she died of septic shock, dehydration, and fever at a hospital in El Paso, Texas. Agents called for a medical helicopter to get her there after she arrived at the Lordsburg facility unresponsive. She had to be revived twice. Homeland Security says it's tragic, but it shows the dangers of illegal border crossing.
What happened here was they were about 90 miles away from where we could process them. They came in such a large crowd that it took our Border Patrol folks a couple times to get them all. We gave immediate care.
Meanwhile, congressional Democrats are calling for a full investigation into the death, saying it raises significant questions about how children are treated at Border Patrol facilities. They sent a letter to the acting inspector general asking questions over whether she was given any food or water and why Congress was first made aware of the death from media reports, not from Border Patrol. In the Senate, similar outrage. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer tweeting, "A 7-year-old girl should not be dying of dehydration and shock in Customs and Border Protection custody. Secretary Nielsen and DHS Gov must be held accountable for Jacqueline Amay Rosemary Call McKean's death." The girl's father is at Annunciation House. It's a transitional housing facility in El Paso, and he issued a statement just moments ago calling for an investigation into the death and saying he had given his daughter food and water during their journey, and she had not been crossing the desert for several days, as some media has been reporting. Arthel.
Jackie Heinrich, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, in California, a state lawmaker was arrested for spanking his daughter. Police are questioning his account of what happened. Plus, President Trump going toe-to-toe with Democrats to try and keep the government open and find a way to fund his border wall. We'll break down the budget battle and if the president and Congress can reach an agreement with that deadline fast approaching.
We have solutions that will pass the House and Senate right now and will not shut down the government, and that's what we're urging you to do, not threaten to shut down the government.
And feel like we have work that we need to do with our kids. That night was a night that she was acting out. It's what parents have to be able to do to have some ground rules and be able to be good parents.
Police say the injury was not on the child's buttocks, despite Arambula saying he only spanked her. The lawmaker has not been formally charged.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely.
fair enough.
And I am proud, and I'll tell you what,
disagree.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck, because the people of this country don't want criminals and people that have lots of problems and drugs pouring into our country. So I will take the mantle.
Did you see that session in the Oval Office? It's democracy in action, your government at work. As the president went head-to-head with Senator Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi in the Oval Office over the question of the border wall. The president, as he has said, pushing to fully fund his long-promised wall. It's an issue now front and center in the fight to avoid a partial government shutdown that he is proposing. Crucial departments like the TSA and Homeland Security could be affected just days before Christmas if both sides don't reach an agreement next week. What could happen? David Marcus here, news editor for the Washington Examiner. Dave, first, let's start with the fact that was just a fascinating, amazing glimpse. Some people criticize it, saying they're arguing. But, I mean, those are the two positions going head-to-head, toe-to-toe together in the Oval Office, laying out the whole argument over this issue in front of millions of Americans.
Absolutely. It was unvarnished. There we had the President of the United States taking it back and forth with the incoming House Speaker, the Democratic leader in the Senate, laying out their respective positions. It's interesting, though, a few days later, we're still essentially at the same place. No real progress has been made on those very key and delicate issues.
So what does that mean with no real progress? Has the president dug a hole for himself? Will he potentially delay this through next month when the Democrats take Congress? What do you predict could happen?
There have been so many of these budget showdowns in recent years, whether it was Republicans or Democrats in Congress, President Trump, President Obama before him. Usually they find some way to work it out in the closing hours, even minutes. But this time they are at a real hard impasse. President Trump made that southern border wall a key campaign plank. He doesn't want to back off. Democrats are saying no way. Probably they will find some way to push this at least into the new year, into January, maybe till next year. But that probably won't happen until the last possible hours, even minutes.
Well, they could approve some temporary spending extensions, this sort of thing?
That's right. They could just hold the federal spending at current levels. The lawmakers and presidents do this almost every year.
Yeah, we've seen this movie before, I mean, constantly over these issues. I mean, why are the Democrats seemingly so obstinate? They say that they will provide $1.3 billion in funding for fences and border security, not for open borders, if the president is insistent on $5 billion for the border wall.
Democrats won big in November, at least on the House side. They feel like they have a lot more leverage than they did even a year ago, when they might very well have gone along with at least some version of a border wall, maybe trading it for something on migrants, something else like that. This time, though, their activist base on the left is saying, no way, no money for the border wall, and that's who they're listening to.
Well, could that activist base, they potentially could cut a deal, maybe, if you give everything for the Dreamers and get that through in exchange for money for the border wall? Is that a possibility?
Those kind of deals have been suggested in the past. At various points, President Trump seemed open to that. Democrats in Congress at times, 6 months ago, a year ago, seemed somewhat open to that. But now it seems like we're pretty far gone. Neither side really wants to give in for various reasons. Each side thinks they have enough leverage to win this fight. And that's where we're heading to right into Christmas.
Well, after that meeting, the president talked more about this. Here's what he said on this issue.
I don't mind owning that issue. I mean, Chuck's problem is that, when wheat last slows down, that was his idea. And honestly, he got killed. And so he doesn't want to own it. And I said, you know what? Rather than us debating who's owning it, I'll take it. I'll take it. If we close down the country, I will take it, because we're closing it down for border security. And I think I win that every single time.
So who blinks if anyone does?
Well, that is accurate there, what the president said about owning it. He's willing to do it. The president, though, has also given himself a few outs. He talked about the military building the wall. That's dubious on legal grounds. Other ways, maybe putting up a fence, as we saw in the prior report. So he might have some ways of saying that he's building a wall without actually getting money from Congress. That's where we may be headed.
Do you think that with all these arguments, and it keeps on going, that there will be or there can be any type of resolution to this issue finally? Or is Washington just continually stuck in the gridlock when it comes to this issue?
This one seems pretty tough to see a path forward on. Democrats in Congress, for various reasons, a lot, again, having to do with their supporters, just will not go along with the wall. Not to mention there are actually a bunch of logistical issues about building the wall itself, but that's a whole other discussion. So I think they will find some way to save face on both sides, get into the new year. Depending how far into the new year, we will have to see.
You're talking about eminent domain and problems with some private property and land where the wall will go logistically, as you just said. But one final point. The Democrats, with more activists and more left Democrats, for example, that we're seeing coming into the new Congress, with the Democratic Congress, does that then make it potentially harder to get a deal?
Yes, Nancy Pelosi, agree with her or not on issues, she's a very good politician. She knows where her supporters lie, where the votes are within her own Democratic caucus. She's not going to get out too far ahead of them, push something with President Trump that they don't agree with. So she's somewhat constrained. And remember, she's been fighting for her own position as incoming speaker. It looks like she's probably got it now, but she had to make a lot of promises to her own supporters to do that. A lot of them probably are not in a big mood to give away a big issue like this.
All right, we'll see what happens, even if they push it temporarily into next month or not. David Mark, Washington Examiner. David, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Martha?
Well, international tensions rising after China detains 2 Canadian citizens. Could this impact trade talks between the U.S. and China? We'll take that up next. Plus, thousands of yellow vest protesters take to the streets of Paris for a 5th consecutive weekend. We're on that scene straight ahead.
States has stood for that, whether they're our citizens or citizens of other countries. We ask all nations of the world to treat other citizens properly, and the detention of these 2 Canadian citizens in China ought to end.
Well, that's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo slamming China for detaining 2 Canadian citizens, Michael Spavor and Mr. Kovrig, a former diplomat. This is coming following the arrest in Canada of a senior Huawei executive on a U.S. extradition warrant. Meanwhile, Canada promises a full judicial process for the Chinese tech executive.
We discussed China and the case of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, building on a conversation that Secretary Pompeo and I began soon after her arrest. We all agree that the most important thing we can do is to uphold the rule of law ensure that Ms. Meng's right to due process is respected, and that the current judicial process in Canada remains apolitical.
Let's bring in Jonathan Wachtel, former Director of Communications and spokesperson at the United States Mission to the United Nations. Jonathan, good to have you back to talk about this. We were talking about it last weekend, I believe, and it's a dangerous game of tit for tat that seems to be getting deeper. I mean, to where is this path leading?
So far, it's going down a path that's particularly unhelpful. And yes, Arthel, last week we both agreed that this is going to get worse before it gets better. And it's showing signs of getting worse even more. It is terrific that Secretary of State Pompeo stood side by side with the Canadian Foreign Minister and said these two Canadians need to be released immediately. This is ridiculous, and they can't be connected to what's going on with Ms. Meng. I mean, they're two different things altogether, and a tit-for-tat type of thing, as you know, that can lead to more escalation. It can lead to more arrests, more anger between two nations. Now, the Canadians are stuck in the crossfire between the United States and China.
And that's an excellent point because, I mean, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of the U.S., so she can't leave Canada. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister in Canada, has said that he has no political motive for detaining her. So how does Canada get from between the U.S. and China on this?
The unfortunate thing for Canada is that it's a decent nation and it's stuck in the crosshairs, as I said. They're a law-abiding country and they're going to go by the books here. They need to go by the books. They don't have a government that's like the government in China. China has a totally different way of doing things. People disappear. People don't get the justice that they deserve. They're presumed guilty. You know, the treatment is totally different. This is a Western nation, similar policies to our own here in the United States. We are friends. We have laws, and we are run by laws. We're not run by men. China is a country in which you have a small leadership that controls it, and that's it, and they get the final say.
Yeah.
It's a totally different system, and we really have to have the backs of our Canadian friends here because they haplessly are in the middle of this problem, but they have no choice but to follow the law and help the United States carry out what it needs to do with the agreements that we have.
So how will the DOJ handle this? I mean, will Meng Wanzhou ever be brought to the U.S. to face trial?
That's to be determined. There is going to be, of course, hearings in Canada to determine whether there are grounds for the extradition. There's a lot of controversy over what the president said about, how he's going to navigate through things with the Chinese, and perhaps tying this in with the dispute that we're having in the trade war with the Chinese. The important thing here is to make sure that the sense of Canada and the United States, that the people of our nations understand that the governments of our two nations, our great nations, are performing in a legal and lawful way, which is the way it should be. It shouldn't be carried out by special favors and things like that. It has to be done above board. Now, having said that, there are situations in which the President of the United States has the power to intervene and carry out things that he thinks are expedient to do for the greater good of what he's trying to achieve. It's a debatable thing. President Obama, for instance, in trying to get the Iran nuclear deal agreed, had the Justice Department drop charges against 14 Iranians. Very controversial decision back there. He felt it was the right thing to do. We both know how controversial that Iran deal is. Here's the President of the United States now today, President Trump, trying to figure out what he's going to do in the midst of all this. The administration has got to get it right. Very important to deal with this in a very sober and not just the short-term gains. You have to look at this long-term, because we can have situations which other countries can do things that we don't want to see them do. What you do unto others, you
absolutely
don't necessarily want them to do to you.
Don't want to jeopardize or endanger some of our own executives traveling in various parts of the world doing business. Quickly and finally, if you can do this succinctly, you say how difficult it is for the U.S. to proceed from here. President Trump and the administration working together to figure out their way forward. President Trump often depends on his own gut. Does he really need to listen to the team on this one?
He has to think about the short-term and the long-term goals. He has to listen to his team. He has to understand the stakes here. He has to understand what's going on. Why did the Justice Department decide to move ahead with this? Why do they see her as having conducted criminal activity? Don't take any of this lightly. There are big decisions to take here. The world's watching. The world is watching how America behaves in this situation. The Canadians right now are taking it really hard. They're getting ridiculed. The Chinese are calling them the 51st state of the United States, that they're lackeys, that they're nothing, that they can whip them around and they're going to cause them more pain. We have to protect our ally at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan Wachtel, thank you, and we'll talk about this again. Hopefully it gets better at some point. Thank you. Eric.
Well, Phil and Jonathan, it's another Saturday of tear gas and rock throwing on the streets of Paris. This is the 5th consecutive weekend of those national protests by the so-called Yellow Vests. You know, the anger and opposition started out a few weeks ago over rising fuel taxes, but since then have morphed into demonstrations against President Emmanuel Macron and his policies of trying to reform long-standing economics policies. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott in Paris has more.
Another day of anti-government protest here in Paris and across France. There were clashes, but not as many as we saw last Saturday here. The so-called Yellow Vest activists were out on the Champs-Élysées, around the old Opera House here, the Louvre Museum, another landmark in Paris. At some locations, police did use tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowds. There was some scuffling between the two sides. 7 are reported to have been injured, but there were 115 arrests today. Last week, there was 1,000. The number of protesters today, something like 4,000. Last week, it was 8,000. Police, though, we can tell you from personal observation, they were out in big numbers. We spent much of the day watching a game of cat and mouse across the city. Authorities trying to avoid a repeat of the violence we have witnessed. One reason for the drop in trouble, concessions made in a national television address earlier this week from President Macron. High taxes, low wages, and a government not seen to be listening to its people thought to be factors in this protest. Another reason, the deadly terror attack this past week in Strasbourg, police finding and killing the man responsible for it on Thursday night. 2 more reasons why there was a decrease in the unrest today: some cold, nasty, wet weather and the upcoming holiday season. But an expert has told us we can expect a very hot January here. In Paris, Greg Palcott, Fox News.
Well, the holiday season is in full swing, and we have some tips that could help you not break the bank. Susan Lee tells us now.
Control. You know, you don't want to let the holidays make you crazy.
It's the most wonderful time of the year, but also the most expensive. 15% of Americans are still paying off last year's holiday debt, which averaged $1,054.
Tally up what you've spent so far. A lot of people have been shopping throughout the year for Christmas, so be aware of what you've already bought, what you've already spent.
Stick to your budget. Finance expert Chris Hogan recommends setting a strict limit on holiday spending and zeroing in on who you'll shop for.
This is where you assign a dollar amount of how much you're going to spend and who you're going to afford to shop for.
Hogan says cash is king, especially during the holidays.
Cash will help you remain in control, and it helps you to understand your limits. If you're going to spend $100 on your brother for Christmas, when that $100 is gone, you stop.
We've all been there. You're ready to pay, and the cashier asks if you'd like to sign up for an extra 10% off. But many experts agree, avoid the store credit card temptation.
These things are sneaky, and they're a thief. I mean, it's amazing that they'll offer you 10% off that day, but charge you 24% every other day.
And it's so tempting, but try to keep purchases for yourself to a minimum.
22% of Americans buy gifts for themselves when they're shopping for others. So don't buy for yourself every time you go out shopping. Take a deep breath and understand the real reason for the season. It's not about how much you spend. Be aware, remain in control, and don't bring debt into your life.
After all, it's your cash. Susan Lee, Fox Business.
Well, meanwhile, the search for a Colorado mom intensifies. Kelsey Barrett has been missing since Thanksgiving. why police have been eyeing her fiance's home. And Michael Cohen, you know what he said, that President Trump ordered those payments to hush up Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal during the presidential campaign. Well, the president says no. Our legal panel here to discuss on what could happen next.
Let me tell you, I never directed him to do anything wrong. Whatever he did on his own. He's a lawyer. A lawyer who represents a client is supposed to do the right thing.
The Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, ruling the landmark health law invalid. You know, millions of Americans rely on the health coverage under Obamacare, and the next legal battle over it is likely headed to the Supreme Court yet again. Hello and welcome to a brand new hour of America's News Headquarters. I'm Eric Shawn.
And I'm Arthel Neville. The decision coming on the eve of the sign-up deadline for coverage for next year. The federal judge siding with 20 Republican-led states that filed a lawsuit, arguing the individual mandate was unconstitutional and Obamacare could not be separated from it. California leading a group of states that plan to challenge the ruling, and Democrats say they will join the fight.
I have every confidence that we're going to join the lawsuit when Democrats take back the House. The Trump administration didn't defend the ACA, and that's not to say it's worked perfectly. We have lots of ideas on how to make it work better and build upon